The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Kelvin tapped his datapad, and I, Thrace of the Velthron Collective, felt my tertiary eyes widen in what I can only describe as pure dread. 3 months into this cultural exchange program at Terran Academy, and I still wasn't prepared for what humans called practical demonstrations. "All right, class," Kelvin announced, his wrinkled face creasing into what humans call a smile, though I'd learned it could mean absolutely anything, from joy to impending disaster. "Today, we're discussing conflict resolution in high-stress scenarios. I've asked 2 of our students to demonstrate." My breathing slits fluttered nervously. High-stress scenarios. Of course, because humans couldn't just discuss things theoretically like civilized species. From the front row, Marcus Webb stood up, a lanky human male with dark hair and the kind of relaxed posture that suggested he'd never encountered danger in his entire 17-year existence. He walked to the front of the class, hands in his pockets, completely unconcerned. Then she stood up, Kira Voss, the human female who sat 3 rows behind me. The one who'd transferred in from some backwater colony world called Ragnar's Edge. The one who moved with a predator's grace that made my species' ancient survival instincts scream danger every single time she passed my desk. The one who, during our first week, had casually mentioned that her morning jog involved traversing terrain that would kill most sentient species within minutes. She walked to the front of the classroom, and I swear on the eternal streams, every non-human student in that room tensed simultaneously. "So," Professor Kelvin continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that half his class was ready to bolt for the exits, "Marcus here is going to simulate an aggressor. Kira will demonstrate de-escalation techniques. Marcus, if you would." What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds, but I remember every horrifying detail with perfect clarity. Marcus reached into his jacket. My translator chip almost short-circuited, trying to process the collective gasp from 23 different species. Because Marcus pulled out a knife. An actual, physical, metal knife, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like death itself given form. The Zenthari twins in the second row went completely rigid, their exoskeletons clicking in panic. Oren, the exchange student from Procyon 5, made a sound I'd never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Even Professor Kelvin took a step backward, his confidence evaporating like moisture in a vacuum. "Marcus, what in the blazing nebulas do you think you're doing?" someone shouted. I think it might have been me, but Marcus just stood there, holding the knife in what I'd learned was called a reverse grip, looking confused by everyone's reaction. "Professor said to simulate an aggressor," he said slowly, as if we were all incredibly stupid. "So I'm, being threatening." "That's a real weapon," squeaked Pip, the Litarian whose species had evolved on a world where the most dangerous predator was roughly equivalent to what humans called a butterfly. "It's just a pocket knife," Marcus protested. "My dad gave it to me for camping." Just a pocket knife. Just a pocket knife. I wanted to explain to this madness-touched human that most civilized species had outlawed bladed weapons approximately 10,000 years ago. That carrying such an implement was considered somewhere between barbaric and psychotic. That the fact he casually kept a killing tool in his jacket for camping was absolutely, fundamentally insane. But I couldn't speak. None of us could. Because we were all staring at Kira Voss. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't shown even the slightest indication that another student had just pulled out a weapon in what was supposed to be a safe educational environment. Instead, she sighed. Actually sighed, like this was the most tedious thing that had happened to her all day. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar accent from the outer colonies, all hard consonants and clipped vowels.
That's not how you hold a knife if you actually mean to use it.
The temperature in the room somehow dropped 10 degrees, despite the climate control being perfectly functional. Marcus blinked. What? You're gripping it wrong, Kira explained, walking toward him with the same casual energy someone might use to discuss the weather. Your thumb's positioned incorrectly. You'd lose control on the first strike. Here, let me show you. Every single survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. The Zenthari twins were already backing toward the door, their multiple limbs trembling. Professor Kelvin had gone pale, which I hadn't known humans could do so dramatically. Kira reached Marcus in 4 steps. Before he could react, before any of us could process what was happening, her hand moved in a blur. One moment, Marcus was, holding the knife. The next moment, Kira was holding the knife, and Marcus was staring at his empty hand, like it had personally betrayed him. See? Kira said conversationally, flipping the knife closed with one hand in a motion so smooth it looked practiced. In a real confrontation, someone who knows what they're doing will disarm you in under a second. Your stance was all wrong. Your grip was amateur, and you telegraphed your intention from 3 meters away. She handed the knife back to Marcus, who took it with shaking hands. Now, Kira continued, turning to address the entire class. Since we're apparently doing practical demonstrations,
Let me show you what actual threat assessment looks like.
Professor Kelvin found his voice. Miss Voss, I don't think that's... You wanted a lesson on high-stress scenarios, Professor. Kira's smile could have frozen hydrogen. Let's make it educational. She pointed at random students. Thrace, you've got 3 escape routes from your current position, but you're sitting in the middle of a row, which means you'd have to climb over Pip and Oren to reach any of them. That's 15 seconds minimum, probably 20, given Pip's anxiety response. You'd never make it. My breathing slits went completely still. She'd analyzed my escape options, just casually analyzed them like it was normal. Zenthari twins, she continued. Your exoskeletons give you physical protection, but limit your mobility in confined spaces. You're already positioned near the door, smart, but you're clustered together, which makes you a single target instead of 2 separate threats. The twins made synchronized clicking sounds of distress. Oren, you're Procyon-born, right? Your species has incredible reflexes, but you've never been in actual danger, have you? You're sitting with your back to the primary entrance. Elementary mistake. Never sit with your back to a door.
Oren's 3 eyes went very, very wide.
Kira walked to the front of the classroom, her movements precise and controlled. Marcus here made 7 critical errors before he even pulled the knife. His breathing changed, his shoulders tensed, his eyes kept flicking to Professor Kelvin for approval. Anyone actually paying attention would have seen it coming from 10 seconds away. She turned to face us all, and in that moment, I understood something fundamental about Kira Voss. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't showing off. This was just who she was. Someone who assessed threats automatically, who calculated odds constantly, who lived in a state of perpetual readiness that would drive most species completely insane. You want to know about de-escalation? Kira asked. Real de-escalation isn't about being nice or diplomatic. It's about making the aggressor understand, immediately and completely, that continuing their current course of action will end badly for them. She looked at Marcus. Marcus, pull the knife again. Actually try to threaten me this time. Kira, I don't think... Marcus started. Do it. The authority in her voice made Marcus move before he could think. He pulled out the knife, opened it, held it up in what he probably thought was a threatening manner. Kira moved. I can't even properly describe what happened. One instant she was standing 2 meters away. The next instant Marcus was on the ground. The knife was skittering across the floor, and Kira had her knee pressed against his chest, with her hand positioned at his throat, in a way that made very, very clear she could end the situation whenever she chose. 3 seconds, she said calmly. That's how long you lasted. And I was being gentle because we're in a classroom. She stood up, offered Marcus her hand, pulled him to his feet. He looked absolutely stunned. That's threat neutralization, Kira announced to the silent room. Marcus isn't hurt, just surprised and hopefully educated. The weapon is secured. The situation is resolved. No violence necessary beyond the absolute minimum required to establish control. Professor Kelvin had regained some of his color. Miss Voss, while that was certainly informative, I'm not sure this is exactly what the curriculum had in mind. You asked for practical demonstrations, Professor. Kira's expression was completely innocent. I'm from a Deathworld colony. This is practical for me. Deathworld. The word hung in the air like a curse. I'd heard the term before, whispered in fearful tones by species who'd encountered humans from the outer colonies, worlds where the environment itself was actively hostile, where simply surviving childhood required skills that would make special forces operatives from civilized worlds look like children playing pretend. How many of you have actually been in a dangerous situation? Kira asked the class. Real danger, not simulated, not theoretical, actual life or death stakes. Silence. Right, Kira said. That's the difference between core world humans and colony world humans. We grow up different. We have to. She walked back to her desk, sat down and pulled out her data pad like nothing unusual had just occurred. Professor Kelvin cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of his classroom. Well, that was certainly... I think we'll take a short break. 15 minutes. Everyone try to calm down. The moment he said it, half the class bolted for the door like their lives depended on it. The Zenthari twins practically trampled each other, trying to escape first. Orin moved with reflexes I didn't know his species possessed, clearing 3 rows of desks in a single leap. I stayed in my seat, mostly because my legs weren't currently capable of supporting my weight. My entire species had evolved on a world where the most aggressive creature was roughly equivalent to what humans called a rabbit, and we'd built our entire civilization on principles of mutual cooperation and conflict avoidance. Watching Kira Voss casually disarm and neutralize another student in under 3 seconds had fundamentally rewritten my understanding of what humans were capable of. Marcus was still standing at the front of the classroom, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. A few students who'd remained were whispering urgently to each other in various languages, my translator chip working overtime to keep up with the panicked commentary. Kira pulled out her water bottle, took a drink, and started scrolling through her datapad with complete disinterest in the chaos she'd just caused. I gathered what remained of my courage and turned around in my seat to look at her. "Do you do that often?" I asked, my voice coming out as more of a squeak than I'd intended. "Disarm people with knives?" She glanced up from her datapad, those unsettling human eyes focusing on me with an intensity that made my survival instincts scream. "Define often. More than, say, never?" "Then yeah, often enough." She shrugged. "Ragnar's Edge isn't exactly a peaceful place. You learn young, or you don't learn at all." I wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what kind of world produced humans like her, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I managed, "You scared everyone." "Good," Kira said simply. Fear is healthy, keeps you alert, keeps you alive. She went back to her data pad, and I turned back around in my seat, my 3 hearts beating at roughly twice their normal rate. 3 months into this cultural exchange, and I was beginning to understand something the rest of the galaxy apparently hadn't fully grasped yet. Humans weren't a unified species. The difference between a human raised on a core world like Earth and a human raised on a colony world like Ragnar's Edge was vast enough to be practically a different subspecies, and we'd just let thousands of colony world humans into our educational institutions, our societies, our carefully constructed, peaceful civilizations without really understanding what we were inviting in. The 15-minute break couldn't end fast enough, and yet I absolutely dreaded what might happen when class resumed. Professor Kelvin returned looking like he'd aged a decade during the break. I noticed he'd brought campus security with him, 2 uniformed officers who positioned themselves near the exits with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely sure what they were supposed to be securing against. Most of the class had returned, though the Zenthari twins were conspicuously absent, and Pip had apparently decided that watching from the hallway through the door window was close enough to attendance. Marcus had moved to the back row, as far from Kira as physically possible while remaining in the classroom. I didn't blame him. I'd considered doing the same thing. But my academic pride wouldn't let me abandon my front row seat just because I was terrified. "All right," Professor Kelvin began, his voice slightly higher-pitched than normal. "Let's continue with something less hands-on. We'll discuss theoretical frameworks for cross-cultural conflict resolution." "Boring," someone muttered. I was 90% certain it was Kira. The professor shot her a look that would have withered most students. Kira just smiled pleasantly and gestured for him to continue. "As I was saying," Kelvin pressed on with admirable determination, "different species approach conflict with vastly different cultural frameworks. For instance, the Velthron Collective, Thrace's people, believe in extensive mediation processes that can take months or even years to resolve disputes." I nodded, grateful to be discussing something familiar and non-threatening. "We have 743 distinct protocols for conflict resolution, each appropriate for different levels of disagreement and social contexts." "Fascinating," drawled Kira from behind me. "What do you do if someone's actively trying to kill you right now and doesn't want to wait for Protocol 600 and whatever?" The classroom went silent again. Even Professor Kelvin seemed at a loss for words. "Well," I said carefully, "that scenario doesn't really occur in Velthron society. We evolved past physical violence approximately 12,000 years ago." "Must be nice," Kira said, and I genuinely couldn't tell if she was being sarcastic or wistful. "On Ragnar's Edge, we've got predators that make your worst nightmares look like bedtime stories. You don't evolve past violence when the planet itself is trying to eat you." Oren raised one of his 3 hands tentatively. "If I may ask, Miss Voss, exactly how dangerous is Ragnar's Edge? For context." Kira leaned back in her chair, and I recognized the expression on her face. I'd seen it before, when humans were about to tell stories they found amusing, but that would absolutely traumatize everyone else listening. "Put it this way," she began. "The colony's survival rate for the first 5 years was about 40%.
Not 40% mortality, 40% survival. Most people who came to Ragnar's Edge died within their first year."
The security officers exchanged nervous glances. The wildlife includes something we call ridge sharks, which are basically land-based apex predators that can smell fear from 3 kilometers away and run at speeds that would make your fastest ground vehicles look slow. There's a plant species that releases neurotoxic spores if you so much as breathe near it wrong. The weather patterns include something we affectionately call murder storms, Because they murder you. And that's just the natural hazards. There are unnatural hazards? I asked, immediately regretting the question. Raiders, claim jumpers, corporate security forces who don't care much about little things like laws or human rights, territorial disputes that get settled with more than just harsh language. Kira counted them off on her fingers like she was listing grocery items. Oh, and once every 3 years or so, we get migrations of something we call bone wolves, which are exactly as friendly as they sound. Professor Kelvin had gone pale again. And children grow up in this environment? The ones who survive do. Kira's tone was matter-of-fact. You learn to shoot before you learn to read. You learn to set perimeter alarms before you learn basic math. You learn which plants will kill you, which animals will kill you, and which humans will kill you, usually in that order, because at least the humans might hesitate. Marcus raised his hand shakily from the back row. Kira, why would anyone choose to live somewhere like that? For the first time since I'd met her, Kira's expression softened slightly. Because it's home. Because the mining prospects are incredible, and people get rich if they survive long enough. Because some folks don't fit anywhere else, and need a place where being dangerous is an asset instead of a liability. Lots of reasons. She paused, then added, My parents were second-wave colonists. They knew what they were getting into. Made sure I knew, too. Are they still there? Asked a student I didn't recognize, one of the Andromedan exchange participants. Yeah, running a claim station near the southern ridge. Last I heard, they'd fought off 3 raider attacks this year, and Mom bagged a ridge shark that tried to break into the supply depot. The pride in Kira's voice was unmistakable. Dad lost 2 fingers to frostbite during the winter, but he says it could have been worse. The Andromedan student made a sound that my translator couldn't quite process, something between horror and disbelief. This is precisely why we need these cultural exchange programs, Professor Kelvin interjected, apparently deciding to reclaim the narrative before it spiraled further. To understand that human experience varies dramatically based on environmental factors. Core world humans and colony world humans face entirely different challenges. Different is putting it mildly, muttered Oren. Kira stood up suddenly, and I swear half the class flinched. She walked to the front of the room with that predatory grace that never seemed to leave her movements. Professor, can I make a suggestion? Kelvin looked wary, but nodded. Certainly, Miss Voss. Instead of talking about theoretical frameworks, why don't we do something practical that won't involve anyone getting disarmed? She glanced at Marcus, who went red. Let's talk about actual cultural misunderstandings that could get someone killed, and how to avoid them. I'm not sure that's... For example, Kira continued, ignoring the interruption, Thrace, you mentioned your people evolved past physical violence 12,000 years ago. That's great. Genuinely impressive. But what happens when one of your people has to interact with someone from a species that hasn't? Someone who interprets your 743 protocols as weakness or an invitation to exploitation. I opened my mouth, then closed it. It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. Exactly, Kira said. Your cultural framework works perfectly in your society. But the galaxy is bigger than that, and not everyone plays by the same rules. Understanding that gap, figuring out how to bridge it without getting yourself killed, that's the real skill. Professor Kelvin stroked his beard thoughtfully. You raise a valid point, Miss Voss. Perhaps we could explore specific scenarios where cultural frameworks clash? Now you're talking, Kira said with genuine enthusiasm. Okay, scenario. Thrace here is on a mixed species station. Someone from an aggressive species, Let's say a Korthan warrior caste decides to challenge him to honor combat because Thrace accidentally bumped into him in a corridor. What does Thrace do? Every eye in the classroom turned to me. I felt my breathing slits flutter nervously. I would attempt to explain that it was an accident? Offer formal apologies according to Korthan custom? Good start, Kira acknowledged. What if the Korthan isn't interested in apologies? What if their culture demands physical satisfaction for the perceived slight? I would seek mediation through station authorities. Station authorities are 3 levels away, and response time is 8 minutes. The Korthan is right in front of you, right now, and getting angrier. Clock's ticking, Thrace. My 3 hearts were racing. This felt uncomfortably like a real threat assessment. I don't know. My people aren't equipped for physical confrontation. Wrong answer, Kira said, but her tone wasn't cruel. The right answer is, you don't have to win the fight. You just have to survive until help arrives. That means understanding basic defensive positions, knowing how to create distance, recognizing when someone's about to strike so you can dodge instead of getting hit. She demonstrated, moving through positions that looked simple, but I knew were probably far more complex than they appeared. You don't need to become a warrior. You just need to not be helpless. There's a massive difference. Oren raised his hand again. But isn't the goal to prevent the confrontation entirely? Ideal goal, sure, Kira agreed. But you can't always control other people's actions. You can only control your response. Having options means you're less likely to panic, which means you're more likely to find a peaceful solution because you're thinking clearly instead of being frozen by fear. She returned to her seat, and I realized something that probably should have been obvious from the start. Kira wasn't trying to scare us. She was trying to prepare us. In her worldview, knowledge about danger was protection, not something to be sheltered from. That's actually quite insightful, Professor Kelvin admitted reluctantly, though I maintain we should focus primarily on conflict prevention. Can't prevent what you don't understand, Kira countered. And you can't understand violence by pretending it doesn't exist. The rest of the class period became something I hadn't expected, an actual productive discussion. Kira described scenarios from her experience, things that would never appear in our sanitized textbooks. The time she talked down a drunken miner who'd pulled a weapon in a dispute over claim boundaries. The protocols her settlement used for early warning systems against predator migrations. The way different human colonies had developed their own unique cultures based on environmental pressures. Other students began contributing too. The Andromedan student talked about their species' ritual combat traditions and how they'd been misinterpreted by other cultures. Oren shared a story about Procyon diplomatic protocols that had nearly started a war due to a misunderstood gesture. Even I found myself participating, explaining how Velthron conflict resolution worked, and, thanks to Kira's pointed questions, acknowledging its limitations in less civilized contexts. By the time class ended, the atmosphere had completely changed. The fear hadn't disappeared exactly, but it had transformed into something more like respect, mixed with cautious fascination. As students filed out, I gathered my courage and approached Kira, who was packing up her things. "That was educational," I said carefully. She looked up, and I was surprised to see her smile. A real smile this time, not the predatory expression from earlier. "You did good, Thrace. Took guts to keep engaging instead of shutting down." "I'm still terrified of you," I admitted. "Smart." She slung her bag over her shoulder. "But terror shouldn't mean paralysis. It should mean awareness." "Is that a Ragnar's Edge saying?" "Nah, that's just common sense where I'm from. Fear keeps you alert. Panic gets you killed. There's a difference. We walked out of the classroom together, an unlikely pair. The Velthron Collective's idea of an ideal scholar and a human raised on a Deathworld colony where survival required skills that would give most civilized species nightmares. "Can I ask you something?" I ventured as we headed down the corridor. "Shoot." I flinched at the expression before remembering it was human slang. "Why did you come here? To Terran Academy? You could have stayed on Ragnar's Edge, worked the claims with your parents." Kira was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Because knowing how to survive isn't the same as knowing how to build something. My parents survived, built a life out there. But I want to understand how to build bridges between different kinds of humans, different kinds of people. Can't do that if I only know one way of living. Even if the other ways seem softer, less practical. Especially then." She stopped walking, turned to face me. "You know what the real challenge is, Thrace? It's not learning to fight or learning to survive. It's learning when not to fight. Learning to exist in a place where you don't need those skills, but still carry them with you. Learning to be strong without being threatening. Is that what today was about? In class? Maybe." Her smile was rueful. "Or maybe I just got tired of watching Marcus fumble around with a knife like an amateur and decided to make a point. Hard to say." I made a sound that was probably the Velthron equivalent of a laugh. "You definitely made a point. Several of them, actually." "Good. Now you and your classmates will think twice before assuming all humans are the same. Core worlders, colony worlders. We're all human, but we're shaped by where we come from." She started walking again. "Same as every other species in the galaxy, really. Your people on Velthron Prime probably have different perspectives than Velthron colonists on gentler worlds." She was right, of course. We did. But the gap wasn't nearly as vast as the chasm between someone like Marcus and someone like Kira. We reached the intersection where our paths diverged, her heading to advanced survival techniques, class, because of course that was an elective she'd chosen, and me toward comparative literature. "Hey, Thrace!" Kira called as I started to walk away. "You ever want to learn some basic defensive techniques? Stuff that might actually work with your physiology? Let me know. Can't promise to make you dangerous, but I can probably teach you to be less helpless." I considered the offer. Every instinct I possessed said to politely decline, to stick to what I knew, to avoid anything that might normalize violence. But I thought about her question from earlier. What would I do if confronted by someone who didn't respect my protocols, who saw my peaceful nature as weakness to exploit? "I'll think about it," I said finally. Kira nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer. "Good enough. See you next class, Thrace. Try not to sit with your back to the door." She walked away, and I stood there for a moment, processing everything that had happened. In the span of 2 hours, my understanding of humans had been fundamentally altered. They weren't the unified, moderately dangerous species I'd been taught about in orientation. They were diverse, shaped by countless different environments and pressures, ranging from the peaceful and civilized to the absolutely terrifying. And somehow, we were all expected to coexist, to learn from each other, to build a functioning galactic society that accommodated everyone, from conflict-averse Velthron scholars to Deathworld survivors who could disarm armed opponents in under 3 seconds. It was going to be complicated, probably frustrating, occasionally terrifying. But as I headed to my next class, I found myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what made it worth doing. After all, If Kira Voss could learn to exist in a civilized society without constantly being in survival mode, surely I could learn to exist in a galaxy that wasn't always peaceful without completely abandoning my principles. It was going to be one hell of an Titan. Education.